So just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Carissa, and I'm co-president of the Penn Club of the UK, along with Margot, who's also on the call, who has a lovely Penn background right now. And we're really, really happy that you could join us this afternoon to kick off our lunchtime webinar series. A bit of ground rules. Just, we want to make sure we don't really pick up background noise, so we're encouraging people to kind of turn off their sound, just so we can make sure we can hear Rajesh and anyone else who's speaking. And just a very, very brief background about myself is that I'm originally from Texas. I went to Penn and graduated in 2015 from the college. And then I came to the UK to do a master's at Imperial College London. And you might notice that this is a bit of a similar journey to Rajesh, who is our key speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce him. So currently he is the Associate Professor of Marketing at Imperial College Business School, and his research area is consumer behavior, especially these days how consumers are using online tools and technology. He did his PhD at Wharton in 2009 in the marketing department, and I know he's really excited to be here today. And I'll hand it over to Margot for a brief introduction as well. And she also has some exciting news about a charity challenge that we're launching.
Okay, good afternoon, or to some of you, maybe good morning. My name is Margot Newberger, and as Carissa mentioned, I am the co-president of the Penn Club of the UK. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar. We're delighted that you're here, and I'd like to welcome both Penn alumni and our friends and guests. I'd also like to say a brief word about an initiative that we're launching in the coming days. As Carissa mentioned, we're starting a fundraising effort to support Penn's Center for Coronavirus Research. Penn is undertaking extensive research to understand this virus and to move quickly with the highest priority projects. More information on our initiative, which we're calling 10 for Penn, will be forthcoming in the next few days, and we'll be very grateful for your participation. Thank you very much, and without further ado, we'll begin.
Great, okay, so Rajesh, let's get started then. So just kind of a general question, which I am sure is on all of our minds. So clearly, consumer behavior.
Before you begin, I just wanted to let the audience know a couple of things. One is that we are recording this presentation, and that if you have questions, please do put them through the chat. And Margot is going to be viewing the chat and then passing on the questions to us. That will be the most efficient way for us to get our conversation going. But again, thank you for having me here. First of all, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to attend this webinar and to chat with Carissa. As she mentioned, we have three things in common: that we're from Texas, we went to Penn, and then also that we're here in London and we went to Imperial. I'm a faculty member here, and Carissa took a MSc program here. So we have a lot to discuss. So thanks.
Great. So thank you. So I guess just kind of, starting out, a very general question about consumer behavior in light of the coronavirus. So clearly it's very different right now. We've probably all adapted our behavior in some ways. But what changes do you think will last, for the future, and which ones do you think are more temporary?
Yeah, so overall, what we're seeing right now, a lot of changes in the way people are using technology. And we're going to discuss that in a poll in a bit also. We'll have a poll coming. A lot of changes in where people are shopping, their frequency of shopping, what things they're buying. So if you look at the sales of certain goods, it's crazy what is popular right now. Things like yeast is very popular, board games, things like that, as you would expect, as people are spending more time at home. So some of these things are really just short-term spikes. People are dealing with the lockdown and they're buying goods that allow them to manage the lockdown for the time being. Others are likely to become a bit longer habit, which we might expect to last at least through this period in which we're uncertain about things like travel and when are we going to be back to normal again with events and so on. And then in the long term, my own view on it is if you look at historically past events of this magnitude, whether it's Spanish influenza, world wars, or even the recessions that happen every decade or so, um, typically after a long enough period, let's say 5, 7 years, those changes in consumer behavior tend to get swamped by a lot of other things that are going on. So we have overall global economic growth. That's the whole background behind everything that's going on. We have um, increased urbanization throughout the world. I don't see that changing. We have changes in technology. Those things are going to be bigger themes when we think about over 10, 15, 20-year span rather than this event. So even though we might be spending more time at home cooking and not going to restaurants much, it's not so clear that that would last for 10, 15 years, or that people will have a new set of norms or culture will develop based on that. There's a lot more other things going on in society. And much of what we see in consumer behavior is more fundamental to our social needs. So why do people go to restaurants? They want to hang out with their friends. A lot of it also has to do with status and experience. It's unlikely that those will change. They're just basic human nature things. So I don't see that going away over this longer time period. Um, to give more kind of concrete, though, what we might expect that will be noticeable in kind of this medium to 10-year term, let's say. A lot of it is about trends that were already taking place are going to be accelerated, especially when it comes to digitalization and the increasing purchase of products through online channels. So to take an example, online groceries. This is one I've looked into a bit. Um, I think many of us probably buy a lot of our food at just the grocery retail store. Some of you probably buy much online through delivery. Overall, online groceries has not been a very popular sector in terms of online sales. Most of the purchases have been in store. And when you look at a country like the UK, it's like 7.5%, 7.5% of all grocery retail takes place via online and delivery. The US, 5%, even lower. China is a bit higher, but the growth there has been at a different time period. So you can expect that those numbers are likely to change. We'll see more and more people wanting to buy online. It's difficult because deliveries are not yet optimized for this huge demand, but more people are going to be switching to online groceries. And let's say it goes from, in the US, from 5% to 7.5%, more like the UK number. Um, that's not a fundamental change in the way consumers are behaving, in the sense that we'll still see most people are buying stuff in stores. But from the perspective of someone who's managing the online channels, that 5 to 7.5%, that's a 50% increase, right? Rather than just a 2.5% increase. The way they're viewing it is, what does this mean for our channel and for our revenues in one channel versus another? So those things can be quite significant. They were growing, online grocery sales were growing over time, but what we're seeing right now is this huge jump. People who were not willing to try online groceries before and for delivery or click and collect, now they're actually doing it because they just don't want to take the time to go to a store and of course deal with all the uncertainty of that. So those are the kinds of changes we might expect at the margins. Those who are unsure about a certain technology now are adopting it, and they are likely to continue to do that going forward.
Great, thank you. And I guess in terms of, some of those companies and brands, what can they do to actually stay relevant right now with everything going on? Should they change their advertising in any way, or even, how they treat their employees actually affect the public perception of their brand and whether people would be more likely to buy goods and services from them or not?
Yeah, this is a really key question, which is, it's a tricky one because first of all, I hope everyone is doing well right now, and that's always on everyone's minds, including for these brand managers. And how do you promote your brand without coming across as crass or kind of profiteering or something like this, right? Those are some of the questions. And overall, of course, advertising has dropped considerably. People are not watching as much live television because sports are off and Olympics are postponed. Digital advertising has gone down considerably because that's the very first thing that you can easily pull. And because people are not spending, there's no strong push to try to promote products right now. But the brands that are still promoting, um, rather than focusing on the call to action, which is come and buy this product, it's more about overall brand messaging, trying to build up the brand's image. So that has been a very key shift. So it used to be you would promote sales, you would promote specific events or a specific product. Now, at least for this time, it shifted more towards here's our brand, what does our brand mean, and developing that brand relationship further with consumers. Uh, what I've seen in terms of the surveys on this is that people are generally pretty okay with brands using older ads that depict people hanging out with each other or things like that that we no longer can do. That's okay. That's not so much of a problem. They just want to have a return to normalcy. So I don't think that it's necessarily requires a huge shift in the messaging. Um, People still have their brands that they feel very close to, that they have strong feeling with, nostalgic brands, brands that they've used for a long time, and those brands should still promote themselves. Um, but what they don't want to do is make empty promises. So this is where I personally have a lot of my own criticisms. I'm sure many of you have gotten a message that says something like, "We're here for you," right? This is our brand, and we're here for you, or we're helping you with the pandemic. And a lot of that is quite empty, especially because all the brands are doing the same message. So shift more towards not just "we're here for you," which is very generic, but rather here's something specific that we as a brand can do for you, whether it's our product itself or thinking about your past memories of using this brand, those kinds of things that can help you during this time period where you're at home. And some brands have been very effective at that, which is, for instance, some of the major FMCG food product brands are posting recipes online to help people. That's just an example where you think about how people are living their life now and what you can do to help them. It's still, again, about providing value to customers and not trying to overpromise. That's where the brands that have done that have achieved a lot of success recently.
And I guess, are there any brands that you think maybe haven't done such a great job or have come off as really unauthentic during this time period?
There's been a few cases in which couple of things. One, you have brands that are trying to use humor during the crisis, which doesn't really work that well for many of the brands. I think you can make certain jokes, like the fact that people are having to get their haircut at home or things like that, right? But we don't want to make light of situations too much. And the other is it's related to a question you asked earlier, Carissa, which is what about brands and the employee welfare, and how does the message that they have to consumers um, also line up with how they're treating their own employees? And so you've had a few cases where brands have had blowback related to, on the one hand, they're saying we're here for you, and they're asking for consumers to be patient with them, but they're demanding a lot for their own employees to put them in situations in which maybe they have high exposure to the coronavirus. And we see that with cases like Walmart and Amazon and others. And right now, also with that, we think about the public crisis and the brand itself, you have brands that are asking for government support, bailouts, and things like that. And then the question is, where were you for us earlier in other times? So many companies have to tread lightly with this because that then influences the way people perceive the brand. And at least some consumers, that will shift the way they purchase. I don't tend to think these things get much noticed by the typical consumer. They're much more concerned about, are you delivering the goods to us when we need it? And are you doing the right thing in terms of, let's say I'm a customer and I go into your store and is it clean, and those kinds of things. Those more direct encounters are the ones that consumers care about the most. But even these overall corporate scandals can play a role for how the brand develops.
Thank you. And I'm sure, it'd be great to get some insight from the audience. So I think we have a poll planned.
Yes.
So should we do that now?
Yes, I'm excited to see what people have to say in these polls.
So I can launch the poll. Okay, does everyone see it? Great.
So I encourage you to please answer as honestly as possible. And I can ask the questions also out loud. First one, last year, how often did you pay for products and services in cash? Less than once a month, 2 to 3 times a month. So it's about a frequency. The second is the one that I think will be a lot of fun. I'd like you to try to guess or look into your own smartphone screen time last week. And I ask about last week because, at least for Apple, which is the one that I use, it's easy to actually see last week's screen time. The current week, it depends on how you count it, so it's not as easy. So try to look at last week's screen time and report that. The third question, I ask about your own work from home situation. To what extent were you working from home? Do you have some other options? And then the fourth question is about your own air travel. How often did you travel by air? Either you can count it out for the entire year of 2019 or select one of the frequency options. So we have okay, Carissa, I don't know if you're able to see the results pop up there.
Yes, I can. So for the first, I can go through the first question and let you know what the results are. Or if I end the poll, do you know if that will actually share the results with everyone?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like there are a couple more people who need to answer if able, but I'll end it in a few seconds.
Yeah, and maybe what you could do is, if the poll results pop up, maybe you're able to share the screen.
Yes. 1 second. Okay, so can everyone see the results? Hold on.
I think we can only see your
desktop. Okay, sorry. I'm gonna okay, change it to you.
Oh, okay.
There. Does that work?
Okay, yeah, that works. Yeah.
Perfect.
So I can just then report over the results. So how often did you pay for products using cash? The most frequent response is 2 to 3 times per month, 40%. Next was less than once a month, 25%. And then around once a week, a few times each week was the remaining around 30%. Nobody did most days. Second question, average hours of daily smartphone screen time. There were 14% of you who picked the option that had an exclamation point, more than 8 hours. 5%, 7 to 8 hours, 10%, 6 to 7 hours, another 14%, 5 to 6 hours, 1 to 2 hours is only 10%, 2 to 3 hours only 19%. So we see a lot of people are using more than 4 to 5 hours. Question 3, earlier this year prior to COVID-19, what was your own work from home situation like? Half of you, it was some work from home. Another 30% was no work from home. And only 10% was mostly work from home, and 10% all work from home. Number 4, how often did you travel by air in 2019? 10% was 1 to 3 times. 24% was 4 to 6 times total. 1/3 was around once every 6 weeks. Then 14% around once a month, 5% around twice a month, and 14% more than twice a month. And so we see really interesting statistics here, and I certainly don't want to imply that this is a representative sample at all. This is a different group, right? But I wanted to launch these questions because they get at some of the changes that are happening right now that many other people are adjusting to very rapidly. And the question is, how this is going to change consumer behavior going forward. So for instance, the use of cash. So right now, many of the stores have tried to encourage use of contactless payments or even just outright required it for customers. This is a pretty big change when you look at, even though within this audience, we see that most of you are using debit cards and credit cards and Apple Pay and so on all the time. Overall cash usage is pretty high in even still today in the overall population. US, UK, China, it's around 40% of all transactions are made in cash currently in these 3 big economies. And then in other economies, you see it's even bigger. I don't know if we have any participants here from Germany or Southern Europe. Germany loves to use cash. If you've ever traveled to Germany, you know that there's a lot of cash usage there. And the only countries that are really ahead of this, countries like South Korea, where they use a lot more digital payment. So that's a pretty big change. Many people now are adapting the use of debit cards or Apple Pay for the first time. They're used to spending in cash. The second, which is on smartphone screen time, this is, I know many of you have probably been trying to reduce your screen time over the last 1 or 2 years. This has been more of a kind of the key self-control issue. But when you look at the trends in the last month, the average smartphone screen time usage has increased by about 30 minutes. And that's just with your smartphone. When you consider that you're spending so much time on your computer, your tablet, or television, overall screen time is up dramatically since the pandemic. So it's a question, to what extent are we going to be able to bring those numbers down? Or are people going to get even more accustomed to socializing via Zoom and other kinds of channels? The third question, which is, what was your own work from home situation like? Half of you said some work from home, 27% said no work from home. And I'm sure each one of you has your own personal experience with this. And there's a question of whether your own office will promote more work from home after this is all said and done. But it is looking like, at least the way trends are going, what we're seeing from the response from business, many managers are going to allow more work from home, at least even past this lockdown period. We're going to get some more news from the UK next week on when people will be able to return for certain industries. But it looks like for many office workers, this is likely to continue at least in a fractional way, where some part of the day maybe you work from home, or some groups will work from home. And that's going to be a pretty big change there in terms of the trend. We were already seeing more working from home, and we can expect that to increase at an accelerating pace. And then the fourth one, which is how often did you travel by air? This is a very globe-trotting audience here, right? Understandably so. And in London, many people fly often, as we see in the numbers here. But that's not in any way representative, of course, of the population. So if you had to guess the mode, the number of flights taken by the average person in the UK, that mode is of course zero, right? Most people don't take any flights in a given year here in the UK or in the US. Um, so that's still there, but importantly, there is a small percentage of the population that accounts for the great majority of the flights. And what we can probably expect is that they're going to reduce their frequency of travel by a fair bit over the next year, given that there's going to be some pretty big changes in the way airlines operate and airports operate. So these are just a few of the ways in which, when we think about the situation in which we're being physically isolated from each other, how that's changing both digitalization, travel, and other kinds of things.
Great, thank you. And I know that we've had quite a few questions come through from the audience. So one that was Justin is about, do you think there'll be a massive flood of dining out, working from the office types of events, given consumers, we've kind of been depriving ourselves of these experiences recently? Or do you think people will kind of fear from COVID and have this persistence to socially distant going forwards?
Yeah, I think there are many ways we might expect pent-up demand to return as soon as the lockdowns are lifted. The problem in trying to project something like that is that we really don't know what restaurants will look like once we return to dining. I think there's been some talk in some countries of trying to encourage more patio outdoor dining, and that might be there. But it's not like we're going to have the coronavirus lockdown is ended and then we can all go celebrate, right? There's still going to be some restrictions in place. So I think that massive flood, I don't necessarily expect, just given that dining itself is so different and people are also reluctant to get on public transport and other kinds of issues. Um, but after this is all said and done, let's say after we have a vaccine, hopefully, fingers crossed, or after things really return to normal, I don't expect that this overall trend that we're seeing globally, which is that people are dining out more, I don't see that reversing. So all over the world, we've seen a trend over, say, 100 years where people are not eating from home as much. It's increased modernization, increased wealth. Those things will still likely continue over the next 20, 30 years. And globally, especially in developing countries, you're seeing more dining out now than they were, say, 30 years ago. Those things will continue to persist and that growth will persist. So on a global level, I think restaurants are likely okay in the long-term trend. The challenge, though, is, of course, for the specific restaurants now, how to survive, how to maintain cash flow, and for, let's say, a restaurant here in London, they can't expect that on the first day there's going to be a huge demand for people to return, and neither will they be able to actually fit it because there's going to be some restrictions on the occupancy of a restaurant.
And it's kind of a follow-up question, like how do you forecast the overall consumer sentiment, given there might initially be high unemployment in most companies? And do you expect a death spiral with low consumption, more layoffs, even less consumption? This is also from the audience.
Yeah, so that's a great question because in some ways the COVID-19 is very different from things that we've seen in the past. But at least in one respect, it is going to be like a massive recession. That's what we're all expecting. And at least with recessions, we have some past data to look at to see what happens with spending. And when you look at these things, past recessions, generally, of course, consumers do tighten their wallets greatly. So there's going to be a lot of unemployment, unfortunately. There's going to be many people whose savings have been reduced drastically or finding themselves with new expenses. And naturally, what they're going to do is drop a lot of the discretionary spending, including, let's say, restaurants, at least for the great majority of consumers. We, though, do have, of course, an upper middle class, a wealthy class, that for whom, say, going to restaurant isn't going to be that different as now versus what it was last year in terms of their overall budget. And what you tend to see in recessions is the majority of people reduce their spending. But those who can afford for, let's say, to go on holidays, to buy cars, those kinds of things, they actually end up spending a little bit more because there's more of an opportunity for them to differentiate themselves positionally in terms of status. So you do see a bit more of a pulling apart during the typical recession. I can't say how that will play out with things like holidays or restaurants, because that also has this social distancing component. But when you see, say, purchasing of luxury goods or cars or other things like this, where a lot of the wealthy spend their money, those areas are likely to get a faster bounce back.
And can you offer some views on consumer behaviors around travel, hospitality, or entertainment? So, going to big venues. And I guess what can these brands and businesses do to regain confidence right now?
Okay, so let's say the brands that are involved in, there's a question more about brands that are involved in festivals and Wimbledon and these kinds of brands, or is the question more about brands in general?
I think both.
Okay. Yeah, so uh, certainly one of the sectors that's being most deeply impacted is tourism, travel, and events. It's expected that especially with the large scale events, will be one of the last things that are brought back in. That being said, I still expect going forward, people will still have an appetite for attending a massive football match, for instance, or going to the Olympics if you're in Japan, let's say next year. Those kinds of things. It's just, again, it's about the human psyche. We love this kind of sense of camaraderie and excitement of being in a big audience. I don't expect that to change fundamentally because it is about human behavior. So that will eventually return. The problem is, at least for the near term, these things are heavily restricted. So the question is, financially, how do they maintain the ability to actually hold those events, say 5 years from now? If they lose too much revenue and they have to reduce the kinds of, let's say, offerings that they have, let's say the scale of the concert or who they can book, those kinds of things, then it's a changed product for consumers, and I'm not so sure whether people will return to something like that. So those are areas that are really in a lot of difficulty for sure, and there's going to be some shaking up of who's on top and who doesn't have enough funds to survive through this crisis. And I don't know, of course, no one really has any idea which kinds of brands will emerge from that. What they can do, though, for the time being, is maintaining their engagement with their audience. You don't want to be forgotten, and you can see this with the sports leagues. What they're doing is they're really trying to keep that engagement going. One of my favorites right now is what the NBA is doing. I don't know if many of you have been watching The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan Bulls, 90s Bulls documentary. It's a great documentary. And this is one of the ways in which the NBA, this documentary was already in development for a long time, but they pushed the airing of it forward to the current period so that people can still maintain their engagement with the NBA. So there are ways in which you can keep that engagement going, and you just have to hold those fans, their attention for a good year or so before you can resume activities. And I think some of these things have such a deep cultural resonance that they're likely to be able to continue, things like Wimbledon or the NBA or major music festivals. But others that are more at the margins that really never took off to begin with and had difficulties to start, they're going to have a much tougher time.
Great. And I guess kind of switching gears in terms of sustainability. So what are your views on whether sustainability concerns will actually translate to behavior? So for example, people and companies will have to make do with less, shift to lots of online deliveries, which might not always be green.
Yeah, so I think sometimes these reactions about the coronavirus and the effect on the environment are a little overblown. Many people are saying, the earth is healing, and they're seeing all these sea mammals throughout Venice and so on, and it's very exciting. And I think that would be great, of course, if the air were cleaner and and the environment will improve because of reduced activity. But overall, we still have a global trend, which is we have billions of people being lifted out of poverty. We have the United States being added to China every decade or so in terms of the number of people that are able to live a middle class lifestyle and be part of the modern economy. Same in other major countries like India and Brazil. Um, so a huge population is going to start spending more money no matter what with this crisis. So the overall effect on the environment is really just going to be swamped by that, the increase in the overall economic activity. Uh, I do think, though, that there will be some sectors, some people, for sure, in places like here in the UK and the US and elsewhere, where this is a real turning point for them, where they're seeing that they're getting a time right now to spend more time with their family, to return to kind of simpler things. And I expect that many of them, as they spend less on taking flights, spend less on buying goods, traveling through the tube or other kinds of things, using less fossil fuel, they're going to change their perspective in a positive way, where they're going to say, I want to return to simplicity. I want to, my activity should be more about being in nature. I should be more supportive of the environment. So I do see at least some segment of people who take on that mindset, and they may be very influential people too, because they're the kinds of people who earlier had a huge spending power. So I think that will be potentially a positive tone. It's just that this is a small segment. Most of the population is more about they aspire to be able to spend money the way that much of the rest of the world that's ahead of them in terms of economic development is doing. And that's going to be the bigger factor.
Okay, so it's kind of a multi-part question, and I'm conscious of time, but it's more about the balance between SMEs and MNCs. So given that a lot of SMEs will be wiped out, do you think the larger corporations will have more control? Also, do you think these MNCs and the consumer will have a more of an anti-China sentiment? Will this fundamentally change consumer behavior, given that a lot of raw materials and products are made in China?
Okay, so those are two quite different questions. The first one, yeah, about the role of corporations and versus say smaller businesses. We can already see this with lots of different industries. The ones that can manage this crisis are the ones that have the huge kind of security in terms of say finances and can weather the crisis. So it's likely, at least for the near term, you can probably see a bit of a pulling apart where the corporations are more likely to survive. You can see this, say, with large restaurant chains are more likely to survive than your local mom and pop restaurant. That's just kind of unfortunate with the way crises typically go. So I expect that to happen, but there's always an opportunity for new ones to emerge. This is more about who can manage the cash flow problems right now and who can return in the future. We already see increasing power towards corporations. That's always been a trend, and I don't see that this is going to in any way reverse that. So that's probably what we would expect for the short term. There's still a lot of room for innovation among small companies. And I can see as the large companies deal with crises and get stuck in their old ways, you're probably going to see some small businesses that emerge that are innovative, that come up with new solutions to overcome the corporate giants. As far as the second question with China, it's really hard to see, at least in my view, whenever I tend to look at consumer grassroots movements, how much of a role does it really play with purchasing? Most people spend based on costs, and they're most concerned with, of course, their wallets, their own budgets. And if China produces the goods most cheaply, many people will say, well, I don't really like that. But the question is, are they willing to pay a premium price so that it's produced in a different kind of country? And I don't, generally speaking, most people are not willing to put their money where their mouth is on that, in terms of consumer behavior. At least that's what we've seen in past crises. That being said, what you might see instead are the not more from the kind of grassroots from consumers asking for products to not be made in China, but rather decisions made within the corporation. So if employees in a company feel that they don't support China and they don't want to have their raw materials sourced from China, as an example, I'm not sure how many people will feel that way. Then we could see some companies just shifting their supply chains simply more for how their own company feels about it, the support that they get internally.
Thank you. And just to sneak in one final question from Andrew, do you think that the Lakers would have won the NBA championships this year with LeBron James and Anthony Davis? Just to
So
keep you.
I'm out of the sports prediction business. My team is the Spurs. So we had many great years. Andrew, thanks for that question. Um, but I thought that they would have won. It's really unfortunate because this is going to be an exciting year in the NBA and in the other leagues and the Olympics. And I was really looking forward to Wimbledon also this year. We have a lot of great players that are um, getting close to the twilight of their careers that are out. So hopefully next year we'll have our excitement back. Let's see.
Great, thank you. And I guess if you could just maybe wrap us up with a few final takeaway thoughts about today's discussion,
Sure,
and also
yeah.
any follow-up items.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for all the great questions, and I hope you saw a bit on how your other audience members, their own behavior, and thought about your own. So just, yeah, 3 points, thinking about the short term, the medium term, and the long term with consumer behavior in this crisis. My overall view in the short term, really dramatic. The changes are crazy. What we've already seen in the last couple months, there's so many stats I can share with you on what is trending and what has declined. So for instance, flights are, I just heard the other day, Heathrow usage is down to just 3% of what it was, say, 1 year ago. So literally 97% down. Um, so that's crazy. Those kinds of things are, we're going to see that for the next couple months or however long these current policies are in place. So that's key. In the medium term, we can probably see that there's a jump then in trends. There's a recession that we're all kind of bracing for. And that changes things in a bit more predictable ways based on past recessions. So tightening of wallets, etc. But I would really want to just kind of reassure everyone that, I mean, think about the long term. Although this is a very difficult time for all of us, there's so many more things going on in the history of, say, the last 20, 30 years outside of this current crisis that are probably much more significant. The changes in technology, think about how much the use of smartphones and the internet and all these things have changed us in really drastic ways, much more than this current crisis is likely to do. And the billions of people being lifted out of poverty throughout the world and the growth everywhere. And that's changing things in ways that are much, much stronger. And those are, fortunately, despite the setback, are still happening. So I still remain very optimistic about the future, and it's not just based on what we're seeing in the news now. When you really look at why consumers behave the way they do, it really is about, fundamentally, we are people. We desire social connection. We seek out status also, and all these things. They're not changing now. They're not changing for another 500 years. This is just our nature, and so I think we'll kind of get through this crisis, and then we'll see. Though I think there's certain things, though, really hard to guess, will be really different, and we just don't know what those parts are right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering all our questions today. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. So I know Margot has posted in the chat, if you have anyone, I know we couldn't get to every question, but if there are any burning follow-up questions, please email us and we'll do our best to get back to you. Rajesh will review the questions and write up some great responses. And also we hope to share some more news in the coming days about our charity challenge and other events that we have planned for this month. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you at our next event.
Great.
Thank you so much. It was a very enlightening discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye all.